Happy holidays, everyone. Julia Usher, Recipes for a Sweet Life. I love to go all out at the holidays with Christmas cookie decorating, but typically I don't do your normal flat two-dimensional Santas and Christmas trees and so on. Instead, I like to put my signature 3D flair on things. And that's exactly what we're going to do in this project today. I've got a three-dimensional fireplace vignette that's so regal with such attention to detail that Santa's going to feel like a king when he descends that chimney into this particular scene. It's got crown molding, it's got airbrushed wallpaper, it's got chair rail, it's got garlands upon garlands of evergreens piped with royal icing, it's got royal icing stockings, a royal icing fireplace grill, you name it. Many of the accessories I cover, or will be covering I should say, in next week's video. What I'd like to cover in this video is the basic construction of the fireplace scape itself, really the big pieces and how they go together. I'll also show you how I put all the little elements on them, but as far as how I made each little element, tune in next week and you'll see all of those details. So let's talk about what we'll need for this project, basically again focusing on the assembly of the structure, but first a few notes on the structure. It's not as big as your typical gingerbread house. The base is only about 5 by 8 and the wall in the back is about 8 by 8 3/4. And again, I'll have all the dimensions in the video description. So in that sense, it's relatively manageable in terms of its construction. I do have, however, lots of little tiny elements on it that do take time. And that's why, again, I'm referring you to another video for that. However, I would say this is of enough scale and has enough detail on it that it has a significant presence. So it would look lovely on a sideboard at the holiday seasons with just the backdrop. Or if you want to have it view more fully from all sides, I would recommend putting on another side wall, an optional side wall, so that it's much more viewable, at least on an angle. So with regard to the cookies then needed to do both of those things, you only need 6 pieces if you're going to do the back wall, and you'll need an optional 7th piece for the side wall version. And those pieces are, for the back wall, it's 8 by 8 3/4. Of course, you could scale this up or scale this down, however you'd like. The floor is 5 by 8 inches, and if you're going to do a side wall, I ended up cutting my side wall the same size as my back wall, which means it overhangs a little bit, so I have to fill in this gap down here with some decorations, which I have plenty of. Alternatively, you could cut it 8 3/4 tall and just the length of the width of the floor, which is 5 inches. So I'll have all those dimensions again in the video description. These obviously were not cut with a cutter. Maybe that's not obvious, but I don't have a cutter this big, so I cut them with a custom template, and I'll show that in a bit. The fireplace itself is made up of 4 fundamental pieces: an embossed face with a cutout for the front of the fireplaces, 2 sides that are the same height, and about 1 inch, 1.5 inches deep for the side walls of the fireplace, and then a mantelpiece which looks to be just a little bit broader than the fireplace, so it overhangs a little bit, and a little bit deeper as well. And again, the exact dimensions will be in the video description. And then there are some ancillary cookies, which I haven't included in the 6 to 7 count, that deck out the halls even further. So a molded cookie piece for chair rail, I'll show how to make that. Another molded cookie piece for the crown molding that runs across the top of the back wall. And you'll need several inches of length of each of these because they run the entire length of the back wall. And then you'll need 7 of these little corner pieces. I use these as moldings on the fireplace, 1 in the center, 2 on each of the front-facing corners, also 2 more on the corners that meet up with the side. And then ultimately, you'll have 2 down here as feet. So 7 in total. Those are optional, but they do dress it out and make it look nice. And then of course a whole host of other decorations to deck it out. I'm not going to be showing you the details of making these, I'll just be putting them in place. My other video next week will show many of the details, and I've got previously produced videos that show certain other details. So for instance, the fire was covered in my previous summer grill video. We'll be of course putting that in the fireplace. The logs were done in yet another video, the link to which will be in the video description. These little plates were done in my Mrs. Claus video about this time last year. She was holding a plate of cookies. We're going to be putting some of these plain on the wall. We'll also be making a plate of cookies for Santa in just the way I did in that video. Then I get on to some new accessories, which I'll cover next week. Rugs, like this stamped one on fondant. I'll be showing 2 different ways to make the rugs next week. Little framed photographs or pictures to go on the wall in various sizes. Garlands, which are piped royal icing transfers to go on the walls in the front of the fireplace. Little fondant bows as well to deck out the garlands. No fireplace is complete without hanging stockings, so we've got some royal icing transfers, again covered in next week's video. And I've got lots of little gift packages. Some are actual candies that just look beautiful in foil wrappings. Others are pieces of fondant that I've wrapped in wafer paper, edible papers, or piped with royal icing. And I'm not going to discuss these in detail. You can get creative. You can wrap all sorts of candies in foil papers or just get creative with molding fondant to create little gift packages. Of course, there's some really big and very noticeable accessories on this vignette. The Christmas tree, the fireplace grate, and also the candelabra on top, which is one of my favorite little elements. Those are quite ornate and rather involved, and again are carved off into next week's video. That being said, I want to start first on how to cut some of the large custom shapes and these embossed pieces. Okay, so I've got my dough all rolled out. In this case, I did use rolling guides because it's such a big piece and I want it to be as uniform as possible across the entire length. And for my cutting guide, I'm just using a cardboard template. If you're going to be cutting out a lot of pieces over and over again, I would recommend either getting a custom cutter made or using an acetate plastic template like I've used for the mantle piece because it's cleanable and reusable, more so than cardboard. So I'm just going to lay that on. This is, again, my piece for the floor. The piece for the wall, much bigger template, and side wall would be done exactly the same way. Rolling directly on my silicone baking mat, and then I like to slice one slice up and down as opposed to dragging the knife. Dragging it as little as possible, I get the cleanest cuts that way. And then just clear away the excess, ideally while the template's still on it. It prevents your fingers from pushing in the sides. So that's how to create one big piece. That would go directly onto a baking sheet and into the oven at 375 for about 8 to 10 minutes until lightly browned around the edges, then cooled on a cooling rack. Now we're going to texture. For texturing, I don't roll the dough quite as thick because I really want to get a nice imprint in it, and I find that works a little bit better when the dough is a little bit thinner. So I'd like to then invert it onto the brick texture mat, flip it back over, lightly dust the back, and I'm going to roll it into the mat from the back side till I can almost see the impression through the mat. I think that's pretty good. Cut off the extra, flip it back over, and then release it. And the brick front face and the brick side panels are all created, the texture on them is all created the same way. They're cut just slightly differently. I'm going to use obviously a bigger template with this one and just a simple rectangular one with this one. So I'm just going to concentrate on the fireplace. I've got my template with rough versions of stockings drawn out on it for a sense of scale. And I am going to try to center it in the middle of some bricks because that'll make the cutting of this part easier to do. And again, cutting all directly on the mat. With these pieces still around it, I'm going to take my 2-inch cutter and cut up about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 bricks. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So just about there, and make sure it's centered. And there we have a nice fireplace opening. Any rough edges can be cleaned up with your knife before it goes in the oven or filed afterwards. I just do want to straighten this out a teeny bit. Got a slightly rough cut here. And that lifts up and goes directly on the back of a baking sheet and into the oven. So now we're going to concentrate on 3 molded pieces. The chair rail element that was made with this mold. That's actually the crown molding, I should say. It goes at the top of the wall. The chair rail that runs through the middle of the wall. and then these little corner moldings for the fireplace. I'm going to start with that. These are all oven-proof silicone molds, so I just pack the dough in them. You'll see me doing this in next week's video to make the frames to go on the back of the fireplace. It's the exact same process. So just pack them in. Try to get them as flat as possible because we don't really want them being puffy in the back. Same thing with this molding. And then they're going to go directly in the oven and bake within the molds. And when they're done, they'll all pop out. Again, we don't want it up and above the edge. We want it way deep so that when it rises, it doesn't go up and above the edge of the mold. And about midway through the baking process and all of these molds, I like to take a spatula. These are pretty narrow pieces, so this one would work midway through the process and just pat it down if it's at all puffing up, and that'll help create a clearer imprint as well. If you've got a bigger piece, obviously use a bigger spatula. When they're done, you should be able to invert them and pop them right out because the dough is soft. That's not going to happen now. I have a whole nother video about how to make molded cookies, so I refer you off to that for more details. There are advantages of baking in the mold, but there are often times, or sometimes times, when you might want to bake outside of the mold. Okay, so we're ready to start finishing or icing some of the exposed pieces of the project. And I'm only going to talk about a subset of them, namely the unique finishes on the brick walls, which is kind of whitewashed to mimic my actual fireplace, and also some of the gilded textures that you see on both the crown molding and the chair rail. We're going to do both a sponging and a spraying technique here. And on the brick and the brick corner pieces, we're going to be spraying and sponging on each piece. Here it's sort of one or the other. But before we do that, you want to make sure that all your pieces fit nicely together. This includes the floor and the background as well. You want to file everything off so it's nicely squared off. And especially so for the fireplace, to make sure there's a nice tight fit with seams here and that they're exactly the same height. So this one's obviously taller than the front face, so we're going to need to sand this down a fair bit. You can use sanding paper if you're not going to be eating this project, but obviously it's not a food grade material. So if you are eating it, you're going to want to use your microplaner tool. Just run it up and down, back and forth. It's a little more tedious. Either will work. But again, this is food safe. Sanding paper is not. Turning to the brick, how do we take it from here to here? I start by whitewashing it with white food coloring. Some white food colorings dry faster than the others, so you have to experiment with that. You can accelerate the drying process in a dehydrator if you need to. I think the Americolor dries faster than Wilton, but again, it can take several hours, if not overnight, to dry if you're using a non-quick drying food coloring. And this is just a sponging technique. I'm doing it pretty roughly. I am going to come back and spray it with PME luster spray to get into the holes and to give it a slight sheen, just so it's a little more festive for the holidays. So I might give this a couple of coats because the first coat will bleed through. The gingerbread may bleed through. You don't necessarily need to get the backs, but you might want to get the top edge and the bottom edge. Now we'll do all our spraying at once. So I'm going to set this aside whitewashed for now. These pieces were done similarly. Okay, the first step in working on the crown molding piece, which goes across the top of the back wall, is to clean it up if need be. If there's any extra dough overhanging the molded area, you just want to chip it away. I'm using the tip of a paring knife just to crack off that overhang. And once that's done and cleaned up, we're then ready to highlight it in various ways. You could either sponge it or completely spray it. If you completely spray it with something like this, it's going to go deep in the recesses. Whereas if you sponge it, this is a mixture of alcohol with highlighter dust or luster dust, you can just catch the top elements of the piece. So a couple different options for treating these. I went with this particular look, first sprayed and then sponged. Now, just a point on the mantle top, I did treat it by sponging it with white food coloring, the way I did here. I didn't spray it, just whitewashed it, and then iced it, outlined and flooded it with white royal icing. I have a whole nother video about how to do that process, so I'm not going to talk about how I outlined and flooded, nor am I going to talk about how I outlined and flooded the floor and the backdrop. I basically used ivory on the background in 2 shades, and I used brown on the floor in 1 shade, and I left a little area where the fireplace is going to fit, where I can sit logs into. I left it clear of icing. So my next step is to go from the sponged only look to something more filled in with the recesses completely covered, and I do that with PME luster spray, pearl spray. You want to make sure you cover your work surface and put up a backdrop because this spray goes everywhere, and just give it a nice spritz until you're satisfied with how covered those recesses are. And I handled the corners the same way. And sometimes I'll whitewash again over the top if it's too shiny, or spray it one more time if I wanted this darkness a little bit more opaque. And to get the chair rail fully covered, which is the approach I think I'm going to use, rather than this approach, to get it fully covered and looking more like this or more like this, then I take my luster spray again, spraying approach, and just hit this piece. 2. So that completes the basic sponging and spraying techniques for all of the embossed or textured elements on the fireplace, including the brick and all the moldings. Everything else was outlined and flooded in ways that you'll see as we come to those parts of the video. Now I'm going to put this aside and we're going to start assembling the fireplace. So we're ready to put the fireplace together, the 4 parts, the mantle, which has been iced, and all the textured brick pieces. I'm going to start with the brick pieces first by laying a little bit of royal icing glue. And I've got them up on a support cardboard so that I can easily move them aside while they're drying and move on to something else. And this square styrofoam is to simulate what will be the ultimate wall behind it, because I want to put this together so it sits flush up against that wall as perfectly as possible. So a little bit of glue is going to form this seam, and it's going to go together like so. And then I'm going to back it up to this wall to make sure it's somewhat squared off. And I don't think I got enough glue in there, so we'll fill in a second, but I just want to prop this from the front before I do. So now that it's nicely propped, I'm just going to fill in that seam with a little bit more icing glue to make sure it's completely reinforced and so that there's not a big black gap showing. So you just want to smooth it down with a clean fingertip or a paintbrush, because we're going to be applying a little dotted border there later, and the flatter that seam is, the more flat that border will lay down. I'm just going to square it off with another block, and we'll repeat the same gluing process on the other side. I'm tucking these panels in behind the front piece, not side by side with it, so that that seam is on the side and less visible as well. That's an important point. Filling once again with thick icing glue, smoothing out that seam. Now once that's dried a few minutes and is stable, you can apply the mantle with the same royal icing glue. You can also increase the stability of the bottom piece by reinforcing those top corners with a little more icing from the inside, which I generally like to do. And then just put the mantle on, make sure it's pressed up flush against that styrofoam, not extending any further back than the rest of the fireplace, because you want the whole piece to sit up against the back wall nice and tight in the final construction. Finally, I've got those little corner pieces that we made earlier that I want to put on. I'm only going to use 5 now. The other 2 will go on later in the end assembly. So one over the opening of the fireplace itself, and then a couple on each of the corners, sort of back to each other. I sometimes also trim out the fireplace opening with rolled fondant just to square it off a little bit, but this opening looks pretty darn square, so I'm going to leave it just with naked cookie dough there. You want to get those corners corners pretty tight at the edge. We will be filling them with a little dotted border as well to close that gap. But that looks pretty good. This one, however, does not, so let me just adjust those while the icing is still wet and get them a little closer together so there's less seam to fill. So these little feet down here will ultimately go down as well, but only once we get it on the final floor. And now for the additional finish work, me being a more is more person, I'm coming back in with my beadwork consistency. I'm going to trim out the entire mantle with tiny little beads along the top and fill in some of those seams along the sides of the fireplace and between the corner pieces. Once that's completely dry, we're ready to start putting on swags and stockings. Okay, so I've progressed quite a distance on my fireplace. I trimmed out the base here with fondant, put some beadwork on it. I've also got a number of the garlands up. The garlands, again, I'm going to cover in the next video next week, but I did want to show you how I got little holly berries or cranberries on them before I finish out this vignette. I'll need another big swag, a couple swags for the back wall, so let me just go ahead and do that. I take a relatively loose, not so loose that it becomes a blob, maybe an outlining consistency icing of the similar color, and you want to do this over the tray so you can recover the beads later. I just drop little red nonpareils on there and it sticks wherever that icing was. The underlying icing, of course, was completely dry. So this piece here, completely dry to start. And once it's dry, then I just drop little blobs of icing wherever I want those berries to go, and they'll stick to just the wet part. But let's move on to the stocking part. The swags are really easy to put up just with a little bit of white royal icing glue, but the stockings are a little bit trickier to attach. Here I'm applying the white royal icing glue to the string. The string is not edible, that's the only thing that isn't, but I do need to weight it at the top so that it doesn't slide down until that icing dries. So I'm just using a little fondant mold here, but you could use almost anything that's heavy enough to keep that string from sliding. Now once we've done that, I'm going to attach some little fondant ribbons and dragées. I've got a whole nother video about how to make fondant ribbons and bows, so I'm going to refer you off to that. The key thing here is to just apply them while that fondant is still flexible so they don't crack and break. Now to cover the ends of those fondant strips and that little bit of icing that's showing, I'm just going to tuck some dragées there, using as little white icing as possible. You could use tweezers, but I find I fumble more with tweezers, so I'm just using my fingers. These are 3mm to 4mm dragées, so pretty small. We're going to do the same thing, or something similar I should say, on the corner. Attaching a slightly longer set of ribbons. And then a little mini bow. First let me get all that extra off there, that's not necessary. And again, this mini bow is addressed in my fondant bow and ribbon video. It's about 1/8 of an inch wide, the strips, maybe slightly less. Now while the fondant's still flexible, I can give them a little more flair and lift just by moving them around with my trussing needle. Now we're going to set that aside to dry. We're going to finish some decorating on the background. The background was an hour or more in decorating process, so I've got it more than halfway complete, and I'm just going to finish off the steps that I did on one side on the other side, and then we'll mount the two together. Okay, so I'm now turning to the floor and the background, and I made a lot of progress on these because they use techniques that I show a lot in my other stenciling and airbrushing videos. So I refer to any of those videos for stenciling and airbrushing technique. I'm going to walk you through what was done and finish up the latter half of the back wall. So on the floor, again, that was a 5.5 by 8 inch piece. I outlined it and flooded it all in a light brown royal icing, and then airbrushed it with a light brown airbrush color using this stencil, this wood plank stencil from the Cookie Countess. Now you might be wondering what this place is for. This was to leave a little recess for the fireplace so it would look a little set back. A floor in the fireplace, if you would, for the wood, so the wood wouldn't get too tall in the fireplace. But I want that to kind of disappear, so I am going to sponge that with a little black airbrush coloring just to darken it up. And I've done that to half of the similar kind of space on the background cookie already. This is going to be the back of the fireplace. This is the bottom of the fireplace. And you don't have to get all the way to the edges. The sponge brush is a little too big to do that because we will be covering a lot of it, and some of those corner pieces will be in very, very distant corners. But if you wanted to, you could come in with a smaller brush and get all the way in there. And I just want to sponge out the other half. This is now the back wall, and I would do a similar piece for the side wall if I'm going to frame that out. Now I'm completed all the way from here to here, so all I'm going to do is finish out this latter half, and I'm doing it in an order that I wouldn't typically do it. Normally I'd outline and flood everything, darker tan on the bottom, a lighter tan on top, then I'd stencil the areas. So I stenciled this with the stripe pattern. I am going to finish that over here. And then I stenciled all this with a quatrefoil pattern. Both of these stencils are from my Prettier Plaque series, and I'll have links in the video description. Once that was done, I started gluing on elements. So the chair rail and the crown molding went down next, then the garlands, then the bows and trailers, then the beads. I've put gloves on just because I don't want to get my hands all black. Same process here, just so the fireplace background recedes. It's not going to matter if we don't get completely to the edge, because that's going to be somewhat concealed in the final construction. Now we're going to move on, let that dry a little bit, move on to stenciling this last zone and gluing down the last elements. So again, I'm not doing this in the right sequence. Normally I'd stencil everything first, but I would have to mask off to this extent. You'll notice I'm just stenciling this little quadrant here, but I've masked off all this upper area and side area with plastic wrap and weight it down with weights so that I don't get any errant brown coloring into areas that I've already airbrushed. In this case, I've already airbrushed and fully decorated it. So I think I've got plenty here. The key thing is keeping the stencil flat, and it is lifting in certain areas. So I'm going to almost want to weight down every stripe on this as I airbrush so it stays completely flush against the cookie. Okay, I think that's dark enough. Hopefully it's not too dark. We'll see what it looks like by carefully unveiling. It looks pretty darn good, and I think pretty close to the other side. Let's just carefully lift this off. Similar color. So again, that's exactly how I did that side, and I just used a different stencil, my quatrefoil stencil from my Save the Date set for the upper part. Now I'm going to take the spray backdrop down and just trim out the rest of these pieces. I'm going to start by just sticking the chair rail down. I previously put my finished fireplace, you recall over here drying, now close to me because we're about ready to use it. I previously lined it up here to see where the edge fell, and it falls about here. So my chair rail, there's a finished end and there's an unfinished end. And the finished end I want poking out to the side because that might show. If I don't put a side wall up, you'll see this edge, and I want it to be pretty neat. So again, just back to my icing glue. I'm using white here, and ivory color, the color of the background wall, could also be used. I'm trying to avoid anything too dark because if it gets on the light background colors, it's just harder to clean up. So a fair amount, not so much that too much squeezes out. And I'm going to plant it right there up to that guideline. And I'm going to run it all the way up. There's a little bit of extra space at the bottom. Rather than centering it, I'm going to run it all the way up to the icing above it. And then we'll fill in the bottom with some dots. That's less likely to be viewed because we're also going to be putting a garland down there. But let's move up to the gluing process up here. I only have this one piece to finish out the end. So just making that look continuous there. And then the next element that's going to go down is my corresponding swag of greenery. So before I glue this down, I do want to trim this out with dots, and I wanted to get these red beads down before I do the dots so that the red beads don't stick in the dots. So let's get this bow up here first. I think the bow is going to probably wedge in about here. So I want these pieces coming out of this zone as well. One about there. Just slip this bow in about yonder and then fill around the sides with beads the way we did on the fireplace. So I'm going to use a mixture of big and small dragées to fill in around the bow. And of course that's going to need a little bit of drying time before we put this in a vertical position so that doesn't all fall off, but that looks pretty good. Now down to the beadwork here and attaching this last piece, and then we'll be ready to put it together with the floor and then with the fireplace. So I've got little dots down here underneath. This is just an ivory color that matches the background of the upper wallpaper, and I'm going to just do the same up here to trim out this upper edge. Now with those dots down, I'm ready to stick down my last swag. It would have been hard to get those in with that swag there in the way, and that's going to come up to meet that chair rail. Okay, with our floor done, our background drawing, and our fireplace drawing, we're ready to start putting these three major elements together. I've got a styrofoam support to catch and support the back wall. And we're going to be gluing basically the fireplace directly into it using thick royal icing, this time brown, so it matches the floor. And I'm going to start by putting a healthy dose of icing here. But not so much that it'll smush up. We're going to reinforce a lot that seam from the inside of the fireplace where it can't be seen. And then I want to push that in. Make sure these guys are nicely lined up. And this is straight up and down. Okay, so before we prop it from the front, I need to really fill in the seams here because it's barely making contact here. But the primary area to reinforce is right here between these two elements. And we're going to be putting a ton of icing there because this is all going to be in the fireplace zone. There can't be too much icing in here because this is going to be the primary seam keeping these pieces together. And then the fireplace, of course, once it's glued to this, will also be a seam. But I'm going to conceal some of that with logs and fire. And these logs I talk about how to make in another video, the link to which will be in the video description. The fire was also done in my previous grill video, so there will be a link to that as well. I'm primarily doing this here to just create a seam that holds those pieces together. We do have to build the fire a lot more forward so you can see it here. So I don't want to use all my fire elements in the background quite yet. Now I think I'm ready to put the fireplace on, though normally I would give this quite a lot of drying time, maybe an hour before I attempt to put the fireplace on, but we're moving ahead on video time. You'll notice I also put some big skewers in the back to hold the styrofoam completely steady and vertical. So I've got thick royal icing glue in white now, going down, and this is then going to go up against the wall. So I'm just piping it along the back edges of the fireplace. And we're going to slide it into position. I prefer not to lift it if I don't have to. And that should fit nice and snugly against the wall and act as further reinforcement. One thing you might have noticed when I put up the back wall is that the back of it is completely unfinished. If you want this piece to view beautifully from all sides, then you could, of course, ice the back side of the back wall, but I'm primarily concerned with how it looks from a front-on version because I'm going to display it against a wall. Remember these little brackets? Now is the time to put these guys in front. One on the other side. Now I've got a hearth for the fireplace as well. This is just a piece of marbled fondant that was pre-dried. By marbled fondant, I mean that I mashed gray and white together and left it kind of stripy and not evenly mixed. Then rolled it through my pasta machine on the number 3 or 4 setting and cut out a little rectangle that I knew would fit the width of this. And we're just going to glue that down. So it looks like there's a little hearth. And so now we're just going to build the fire forward. We've got plenty in the deep background holding the wall together, but we need to see a little bit more coming out of the front. So I'm going to do, but we don't want it hitting too much of the hearth. So I'm going to start with a few more logs to fill this space. Being careful not to hit stuff on the fireplace above, because it will break. Okay, so I think that's pretty full. There's a little bit spilling forward on the hearth as if Santa kicked it out of its original position when he came down the chimney. And now we're going to let that dry, but as that's drying, we can move on to do some of these other areas. Okay, one thing you may have noticed, which has been bothering me, is this extra string from hanging the stockings. Now that the stocking is completely dried in place, I'm just going to snip it off so that it's not visible. Okay, before I build out that mantle, I just want to close out these seams with a more delicate and detailed trim. I'm using a number 25 tip, I believe, and a relatively thick brown icing. I'm just going to do a shell border, pushing forward, releasing pressure, pulling back, pushing forward, releasing pressure, pulling back. And that closes off that seam rather nicely. This is a seam I might also put on the side walls of the back wall to finish them off. So my next step is to embellish the back wall. Basically, I want to build from back to front because if I do it in the reverse direction, it's going to be hard to reach back to this back wall eventually. Now I've got these cute little plates that I'm putting on the wall that mimic red transferware. I talk in another video, I believe it's last year's Mrs. Claus video about how to make these. She was holding a plate with cookies. So I refer you to that video in the video description for details on this particular piece. And I'm just sticking them up with white royal icing glue as always. You could also use an ivory color to match the wallpaper. You just basically want to use a color that's not going to show if these should slip around or have to be moved. Next up is my big framed Santa picture, and I talk in next week's video about how to make this accessory. He's basically cookie dough frame and an edible wafer paper image mounted to fondant. Allowed to dry, and now I'm just sticking him on with royal icing glue, as always. I'm going to leave a little distance between the plates and the frame because I want to stick my candelabra, which is one of my favorite accessories, in between the two on the mantle. And I think I'm going to put a tiny little picture to the far right, again leaving some space between Santa and the picture so that I can put another picture frame between them on the mantle. I just don't want everything to look too cluttered once I have pieces on the mantle. Okay, so now that things are reasonably dry on the back wall, I'm ready to mount things on the mantle. I've got a runner that I've made out of rolled fondant, rolled it to the number 3 setting on my pasta machine, and then rubber stamped it with a fun Christmassy rubber stamp. This method is a method I use to create the tree skirt and also the rug that we'll be putting on this vignette, and I'll be doing that in next week's video, so I encourage you to hop on over there to see that. I'm just going to lay it where I want it roughly. It's still kind of moist from cutting it. I'm going to lay it slightly on the diagonal just so it looks a little bit askew because I don't want things too even. And I'm just going to tack down the end with a touch of corn syrup. I'm not even going to lift the whole thing up because it's really not going to go anywhere. If you wanted to give it a little wave or a wrinkle or some fun dimension, you could do that. But I'm just going to leave it pretty flat, trying not to get it on surfaces that we want to leave exposed. Next up, I am going to mount a little picture frame between the two. I created a little royal icing wreath, much the same way I created the garlands, just by piping in a round shape. And again, the garlands are addressed in next week's video. I'm going to use it kind of as an anchor for my little picture. It's going to just keep that picture securely in place. I'm going to put a little bit of royal icing on the back of this and hope that's enough to keep it standing upright. And now the last thing I want to do is put my candelabra, one of my favorite accessories from next week's video, right about yonder. I'm going to probably be just able to pick it up and place it there and not be able to move it. So I'm just going to put the icing where I think I want it and give it one shot at getting it up there. The next thing to do is to get our fireplace grate down, kind of working from the back forward, because once we get too much in the forward, it's hard to reach back. This will be made in detail in next week's video. And I just want to kind of fit it right squarely in front of the fireplace. But I do need to glue that down a little bit, not much. But once I've got it roughly positioned, I'm going to take a little bit of this icing glue, hopefully on my skewer, and put a little bit here. And a little bit on the other side. And just run it over it. And that will hopefully be enough to keep it in place. I want to get it as far back as I can because I have a tree that I want to fit in the foreground. And now, the next thing I want to do is put down a rug, knowing that I'll probably put a Christmas tree off to this side, but let's just focus on the rug. Choosing a different color. This was also stamped fondant similar to this and then trimmed out with little beadwork, which again we'll do in next week's video. Typically I would lay everything out, figure out where I want it to go before I stick anything down with icing, because once it's down with icing it's impossible to move. So the only other elements to go on are my Christmas tree and gifts. So I do want to spend a little bit of time visualizing those. These are just little fondant cubes, either piped or wrapped with edible papers. So some can go on the rug, spilling out over to the tree, maybe even some stacked in the corner. So if you're going to put a sidewall in on this side, you want to make sure that whatever you put on top clears this side and doesn't overhang it so that you can get a sidewall up flush against it. And as an example, you'll see one scrolling overhead. The last element up, of course, would be your tree, which can slide into position. Okay, I'm almost done visualizing what I want in the foreground, the positioning of the gifts and the Christmas tree, but I'm still not quite sure about the Christmas tree because, as you'll see, there's a bit of overhang here on the right, which would be okay if I don't put up a sidewall, but I think I might want to put up a sidewall, in which case I would need to push it in forward and then it starts encroaching upon the fireplace. So I think what I may do in the end scenario is take it off altogether, put it in the foreground further, and then fill in where it is with some other little accessories like this cute little plate of goodies for Santa, and I talk about how to make this in last year's Christmas video, and some additional gifts. But again, get creative with how you lay out the foreground and whether you put up sidewalls. The sky's really the limit. And that more or less completes my 3D Christmas fireplace vignette. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm sure you have many questions about how some of the other edible accessories were made. Everything from the frames in the background, the candelabra, fireplace grill, to the Christmas tree, even the rug are things we talk about in the next video. Things like the plate, the fire, and the logs I talk about in previous videos. So again, I refer you to the video description for those links. Till next video, live sweetly and have a wonderful holiday season.